The rain came down in sheets that evening, heavy and relentless, hammering the polished streets of Beverly Hills until they looked more like rivers than roads. Water rushed past the curbs, swirling around expensive cars parked outside towering mansions. Trees bent under the weight of the storm, their leaves plastered to the ground. But through it all, a lone figure stood unmoving at the wrought iron gate of the Whitfield estate. She was young, maybe 26 at most, her dark hair dripping wet, her clothes soaked through. Yet even as the storm punished her, she stood tall, clutching a tray of homemade cupcakes against her chest, as if it were armor. Her lips trembled with the cold, but her eyes, sharp, unyielding, burned with something no storm could wash away. Diana Santos was no ordinary street vendor. She wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this neighborhood where people measured their worth by the shine of their jewelry and the price of their cars. She had walked miles in the rain because she had no choice. The tray of cupcakes in her arms wasn't just food. It was the last thread of hope for a little girl who waited at home fragile and sick, needing medicine her mother could no longer afford. Diana wasn't begging for pity. She was fighting for survival. And on the balcony of that mansion, watching from behind a crystal window, Richard Whitfield stood with a glass of brandy in his hand. The storm reflected in the pain made it look like his own world was shattering. His tailored shirt hung open at the collar, his hair still neat despite the late hour, but his eyes weren't on the lightning. They were fixed on the woman below. He saw the way she stood there, soaked to the bone yet refusing to bow her head, and something inside him stirred, a mix of curiosity and unease. She looked out of place, yes, but not weak, not broken. It was as if she belonged there in a way that unsettled him. Down below, Margaret Whitfield had no such doubts. She stormed out of the front door, her silk robe clutched tight around her as if the very sight of Diana's presence might stain her. The storm whipped at Margaret's blonde hair, plastering strands across her face, but she didn't care. Her voice cut through the rain like a blade. "Get away from here this instant," she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at the drenched young woman. "People like you don't belong in this neighborhood. Do you understand me?" Diana didn't flinch. The water streamed down her cheeks, mingling with the quiet ache she carried in her chest. But she spoke with a calmness that only made Margaret's fury burn hotter. "Ma'am," she said, her voice steady, "I'm only trying to sell these cupcakes to pay for my daughter's medicine. That's all." Her words should have softened something, but instead Margaret laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and cruel against the storm. She raised her phone, angling it toward Diana with a sneer. "Oh, how perfect," Margaret said. "I'll make sure. Everyone in the neighborhood sees this. I'll post it everywhere. Look at this woman trying to scam her way into our community." For a moment, the rain itself seemed to hush, as though waiting for Diana's response. She didn't move. She didn't beg. She didn't drop her tray or stumble away. Instead, she stood there with quiet dignity, as though the storm belonged to her and not the woman inside the mansion screaming at her. From upstairs, Richard's hand tightened around his glass. Something about the scene unsettled him. His wife's rage felt almost rehearsed, an ugly performance of privilege he had grown too used to. But the young woman, soaked, trembling, her cupcakes ruined by the rain, she didn't look like a beggar. She looked like someone who knew exactly what she was doing, someone who had walked into this storm on purpose, and that was what unnerved him most. Why was she really here? The thunder rolled, shaking the windows of the Whitfield mansion. Margaret's voice grew sharper, louder, desperate to drive Diana away. But Diana remained where she was, her presence as immovable as the storm itself. In that moment, as lightning flashed and illuminated her soaked figure at the gate, Richard realized this was not just another desperate face at his doorstep. Something deeper was at play, something dangerous, something that would change everything. And though he didn't know it yet, the night Diana Santos stood in the storm was the night Richard Whitfield's carefully built empire began to crumble. The rain had eased slightly by the time Margaret stormed back inside, slamming the heavy oak doors with enough force to rattle the chandeliers. But outside the gates, Diana Santos remained exactly where she had been, soaked to the skin, holding her tray of cupcakes against her chest, her eyes unblinking despite the storm's chill. The street lamps flickered against the flooding street, casting an eerie glow over her determined figure. To anyone passing by, she looked like a woman on the verge of collapse. Yet to Richard Whitfield, watching from the upstairs landing, she looked like something else entirely. She looked immovable, as if even the storm itself had no power over her. Margaret's voice cut through the silence, echoing up the staircase. "Richard, I don't know what you're doing staring out that window, but I want that woman gone. Do you understand me? People like her," she practically spat the words, "are nothing but liars. She probably doesn't even have a daughter." Richard didn't answer immediately. He swirled the brandy in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. Down below, Diana shifted her weight but did not retreat. He could see her lips moving, almost like she was whispering to herself. Maybe a prayer, maybe a promise. For a moment, he wondered if she was speaking to someone he could not see. Finally, with a sigh, Richard set his glass down on the polished mahogany railing and descended the stairs. Each step echoed heavily in the cavernous mansion, his presence commanding even before he reached the door. Margaret trailed behind him, her robe dragging across the marble floor, her fury still simmering. When Richard opened the door, the storm rushed inside, a gust of cold air snatching at his shirt. Diana lifted her head, and for the first time, their eyes met. "I'm sorry for my wife's behavior," Richard said, his voice calm but guarded. "You look frozen. Please, come inside. Let's settle this civilly." Margaret gasped, clutching his arm. "Richard, have you lost your mind? You don't invite strangers into our home, especially not—" She stopped herself, but the venom in her tone filled in the silence. Diana's lips curved into the faintest smile. It wasn't gratitude, it was something steadier, something Margaret couldn't understand. She adjusted the tray of cupcakes in her arms and stepped forward, the iron gate swinging shut behind her. Every movement was deliberate, almost rehearsed, as though she knew this moment would come. As she crossed the threshold into the mansion, the storm behind her seemed to roar louder, like a warning. Water dripped from her coat onto the Persian rug that Margaret treasured more than some people valued their families. Margaret's face twisted in outrage. "Look at her, Richard. She's soaking everything. This is absurd." Richard, however, wasn't watching the rug. He was studying the young woman who now stood in his foyer, shaking from the cold but holding her head high. There was no shame in her posture, no trace of desperation. She looked him directly in the eye, as though she had been waiting years to stand in this exact spot. "You must forgive us," Richard said, almost to fill the silence. "Margaret can be intense when it comes to protecting our privacy." Diana accepted the towel he offered but did not sit when he gestured toward an armchair. Instead, she remained standing, the water dripping steadily from her clothes onto the floor. "Your wife is right about one thing, Mr. Whitfield," Diana said softly. "People like me don't really belong in places like this." Her words hung, heavy in the air. Richard tilted his head, unsettled. He expected bitterness or shame in her tone, but instead, there was an edge of confidence, almost defiance. Margaret scoffed. Finally, she admits it. "Richard, enough of this nonsense. Tell her to leave." But Richard didn't. He couldn't. Something in Diana's eyes pinned him in place, a quiet storm behind her calm, a story he couldn't yet see but felt brushing against the edges of his world. For the first time that evening, Richard realized that the drenched young woman standing in his marble foyer might not have come here to beg. She might have come here to challenge everything he thought he controlled. And, though he didn't know it yet, letting her inside his mansion was the first mistake in a chain that would bring his empire to its knees. The storm outside raged on, but inside the Whitfield mansion the air felt heavier than the rain-soaked clouds above Beverly Hills. Diana Santos stood in the middle of the grand foyer, dripping water onto the priceless Persian rug, her tray of ruined cupcakes resting now on a side table where Richard had motioned her to place it. Margaret hovered nearby like a hawk, her arms crossed tightly over her silk robe, eyes narrowed as though she were watching a thief. Richard, on the other hand, leaned against the edge of the staircase, studying the young woman as though she were a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. The silence was unbearable. Finally, Margaret broke it with a sharp laugh. "So tell us, what's your angle? Do you make a habit of parading around gated communities during storms, hoping some rich fool will feel sorry for you?" Diana's gaze flicked to her, calm and unflinching. "No," she said softly. "I don't need pity. I need medicine." Richard raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "Medicine? For what?" Diana reached into the pocket of her soaked coat. For a brief second, Margaret stiffened, as if expecting her to pull out something dangerous. But what Diana unfolded instead was a crumpled photograph. She held it delicately, smoothing it against her palm, then placed it on the table so both of them could see. It was a picture of a little girl, 8 years old, wide eyes, a fragile smile, her bald head covered with a pink scarf. She was lying in a hospital bed, a stuffed rabbit clutched against her chest. "This is my daughter, Luna," Diana said. Her voice didn't shake, but the weight of the words landed heavily in the room. "She has leukemia. The treatment that could save her life costs $5,000 a month." The storm outside seemed to quiet, as though the house itself was listening. Margaret stepped forward, plucking the photo off the table with 2 fingers, turning it this way and that, as though searching for flaws. Her lips curled into a sneer. "How convenient," she said coldly. "A sick child, just when we're supposed to feel sorry for you. Richard, you don't actually believe this, do you? She probably pulled this photo off the internet." Richard didn't respond right away. He studied the photo for several long seconds, his expression unreadable. He'd seen hundreds of medical files, patients turned into statistics. But there was something unsettling about the girl's eyes, something real. Diana's own gaze was fixed firmly on him. She wasn't begging, she wasn't pleading. She was watching him, waiting, as though she were the one measuring him instead of the other way around. At last, Richard set the photograph down. His voice when he spoke was flat and deliberate. $5,000 a month is a lot of money. Tell me, what kind of work did you do before you were selling cupcakes in the rain?" Diana straightened, her shoulders squaring. "I was a nurse," she said, "at Metropolitan Hospital." The reaction was instantaneous. Richard's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered with something he tried to mask, fear or recognition, or perhaps both. Margaret, oblivious, let out a cruel laugh. "A nurse? That explains everything. Fired for incompetence, no doubt. That's why you're standing here dripping water all over my rug instead of working a real job." Diana didn't even blink. Her voice was calm, almost steady enough to be chilling. "I wasn't fired for incompetence, I was fired for asking questions, for questioning protocols that put patients at risk." The thunder cracked outside, rattling the glass panes. For the first time since she had stepped into the mansion, Richard's composure faltered. He cleared his throat, shifting his stance, as if the floor beneath him had suddenly grown unsteady. And in that moment, as Diana quietly held her ground, Margaret's sneering voice faded into background noise. The storm outside, the dripping water, the expensive rug, all of it seemed irrelevant. Because Diana Santos had just spoken the first words that hinted at something much bigger than cupcakes, bigger than charity, bigger than one desperate mother, asking for help. She wasn't here by accident, and Richard Whitfield was beginning to realize it. The storm outside was a steady drumbeat against the glass, but the real storm had moved inside the Whitfield mansion. The air was thick, charged with tension, every word hanging sharp as a blade. Margaret paced near the staircase, her silk robe clinging to her in damp patches from the burst of rain she'd endured earlier. Richard leaned back against the polished railing, his expression carefully guarded, but his eyes betrayed the tiniest flicker of unease. And Diana, soaked to the bone yet standing with quiet dignity in the center of the room, seemed utterly unshaken. Her voice was calm, almost too calm for the weight of what she had just said. "I wasn't fired for incompetence. I was fired for questioning protocols that put patients at risk." Richard's hand tightened subtly around the edge of the staircase, knuckles paling. Margaret, however, laughed, a brittle, venomous sound that filled the cavernous foyer. Oh, please. That's the excuse everyone uses when they can't keep a job. It wasn't me, it was the system. She rolled her eyes dramatically. What's next? You'll say the hospital was conspiring against you? Diana's gaze shifted to Margaret, steady, unwavering. There was no anger in her expression, only a strange serenity. Not conspiring against me, she said softly. Against the patients. Richard cleared his throat, his voice measured, casual in tone but edged with something sharper. And did you report these concerns of yours? To anyone official? Diana turned her head slowly, locking eyes with him. Her wet hair clung to her cheeks, droplets falling to the rug, but her presence filled the room more completely than the storm outside. Yes, she said simply. 3 years of detailed reports to the board of directors, to the health department, to the prosecutor's office. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Lightning flashed, throwing harsh white light across Richard's face, and for a moment Diana saw it, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened, the calculation in his eyes. Margaret, oblivious, gave a short laugh. 3 years of reports and nothing happened? That tells me everything I need to know. If your so-called irregularities were real, someone would have acted. Instead, here you are, selling cupcakes at people's gates. Diana's lips curved into the faintest smile, one that unsettled Margaret more than any outburst ever could. Sometimes, she said gently, justice takes time. Richard's glassy stare didn't leave her. He pushed away from the railing, walking slowly toward her as though testing the air between them. His voice was smooth, controlled, but his eyes betrayed an edge of something darker. And what kind of irregularities were these? Diana held, his gaze unblinking. Overcharging for procedures, denying treatments that were already approved by insurance companies, choosing profits over lives. Every time. The thunder rumbled in response, as if nature itself was listening. Richard's hand flexed at his side, and Margaret scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. Conspiracy theories? She said again. You sound like every bitter ex-employee who couldn't cut it. Richard, you're not actually entertaining this, are you? But Richard wasn't listening to his wife anymore. His attention was locked on Diana, his mind turning furiously. Something in her voice, in her composure, told him she wasn't bluffing. She knew things she had no business knowing. Diana shifted slightly, her eyes flickering from Richard to the enormous portrait hanging above the fireplace. Richard, himself painted larger than life, looking down over his empire. Her voice was steady as she spoke, and it carried a weight that pressed into every corner of the room. I know what men like you do, Mr. Whitfield, she said. You turn hospitals into businesses, patients into numbers, lives into profit, margins. And you think no one will ever hold you accountable because you sit in houses like this while people die quietly where no one is looking. Richard froze. For a fleeting second, his carefully crafted mask slipped and Diana caught it. The flash of recognition, the shadow of guilt. It was gone just as quickly, but it was enough. Margaret's laughter rang hollow in the silence, but neither Diana nor Richard heard it. Because in that charged moment, with rain still pounding against the windows and thunder rolling through the night, Richard Whitfield realized something that made his blood run cold. The woman standing drenched in his foyer wasn't there to sell cupcakes. She was there for him. The storm pressed harder against the mansion windows, a restless rhythm that seemed to echo the tension inside. Diana Santos hadn't moved from her place on the Persian rug, though a pool of rainwater spread slowly beneath her shoes. Richard Whitfield circled her now, like a predator sizing up prey, though the unease in his eyes betrayed that something about her frightened him. Margaret remained perched on the staircase, her arms crossed, glaring as if Diana's very presence polluted her home. Diana reached again into the soaked pocket of her coat and withdrew the photograph she had shown earlier. She smoothed it with her trembling fingers, though her hand did not shake from fear. She placed it gently on the polished coffee table between them. This is Luna, she said, her voice soft but steady. 8 years old. She has leukemia. The treatment that could save her life cost $5,000 a month. Margaret leaned forward, her mouth twisted into disdain. I told you, Richard. Convenient. A sick child's story. She probably doesn't even exist. Diana's eyes flashed, not with anger but with something deeper. She turned the photo so the light from the chandelier illuminated the little girl's smile. The pink scarf covering her bald head, the stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. Details. Too raw, too personal to be fabricated. She exists, Diana said firmly. She's my daughter, my reason for standing in the rain tonight. And she's the reason I refuse to give up no matter how many doors are slammed in my face. Richard bent over the photo, studying it. His expression remained unreadable, but his jaw tightened and Diana could see his mind working, calculating. His tone when he finally spoke was flat. $5,000 a month is a lot of money. For an experimental treatment, nothing guaranteed. For a long moment their eyes locked. His cold, clinical, accustomed to weighing lives against profit margins. Hers unwavering, the eyes of someone who had already lost too much to ever bend again. It isn't about guarantees, Diana said, softly. It's about giving her a chance to live. Something your hospitals refuse to do when the numbers don't add up in your favor. The words hit like lightning, and Richard froze for a split second. He hadn't expected her to say, your hospitals. Margaret frowned, confused. What are you talking about? She snapped. Our hospitals? Richard, what is she insinuating? Diana didn't look at Margaret. She kept her gaze fixed on Richard, her voice as calm as ever. I worked at Metropolitan. For 2 years I saw the decisions being made. Treatments approved one day, canceled the next. Patients, children, denied care because it wasn't profitable enough. I questioned it, and that's why I was fired. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face was still, but his shoulders had stiffened, the mask of indifference slipping by degrees. Margaret let out a scoff. Ridiculous, she said quickly. Do you hear yourself? That's a fantasy. Hospitals save lives. That's what they do. If you were fired, it's because you were incompetent, not because of some imaginary conspiracy. But Richard wasn't looking at his wife. His gaze hadn't left Diana. His voice was low, almost too casual, but there was an edge in it now. You said you reported these concerns? To who? Diana's lips curved faintly. To everyone who would listen. The board, the health department, the prosecutor's office. 3 years of reports. Richard's hand clenched involuntarily at his side. That was when Diana knew she had struck the nerve she came for. He was trying to hide it, but the fear was there, buried just beneath the arrogance. Margaret laughed again, but her voice sounded thinner this time, less certain. 3 years of nothing. And here you are, selling cupcakes. Clearly your little crusade didn't get very far. Diana finally turned her eyes to Margaret, and when she spoke, her words cut sharper than any insult. Sometimes justice takes time. Sometimes it requires patience. The kind of patience men like your husband don't expect a woman like me to have. The storm cracked overhead, rattling the mansion's glass doors. Richard's expression darkened. For the first time that night, he realized the soaked young woman standing in his living room wasn't a beggar at all. She was a threat, and she had just let him know, without raising her voice, without flinching, that she hadn't come here to plead for help. She had come to expose him. The mansion seemed to hold its breath. The storm outside roared against the tall windows, thunder rolling low like a drumbeat of warning. But the real battle was happening inside. Diana Santos stood dripping on the Whitfield's marble floor, her photo of Luna resting between them like a silent witness. Margaret shifted restlessly on the staircase, arms still crossed, but her laughter had died down. Something in Diana's composure, in the calmness of her words, had chipped away at her certainty. Richard broke the silence. His voice was low, measured, but the way his fingers drummed lightly against the table betrayed his unease. You say you saw irregularities. Tell me, what exactly did you mean by that? Diana didn't rush her reply. She lifted her chin, slightly, her eyes steady on his. I meant deliberate decisions that harmed patients, overcharging for basic procedures, canceling life-saving treatments after insurance companies had already approved them, cutting corners always at the expense of the poor. Do you want me to be more specific, Mr. Whitfield? The way she said his name made him blink, as if the power in his own reputation meant nothing to her. Margaret barked a short laugh to break the tension. Specific? Please. This is all nonsense. Just another bitter ex-employee spinning a sob story. But Richard wasn't listening to his wife anymore. His gaze stayed on Diana, sharp and assessing. His voice was casual but too careful. And did these reports of yours lead to anything? Any official investigation? For the first time since she entered the mansion, Diana smiled. It wasn't wide, nor mocking. It was the kind of smile that carried weight. The kind of smile that said she knew something he didn't. Oh yes, she said softly. A very extensive federal investigation. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret's mouth fell open, then she let out another incredulous laugh. A federal investigation? Into what, paperwork errors? Please, if that were true, you'd be in a courtroom, not standing in my foyer dripping rainwater on my rug. Diana turned her eyes back to Richard, ignoring Margaret as though she weren't even in the room. The kind of investigation, she continued evenly, that looks at death reports compared to insurance payouts, especially when patients die after being denied treatments for administrative reasons, treatments that mysteriously get approved after their deaths, maximizing reimbursements. The thunder outside cracked so loudly it rattled the crystal chandelier. Richard's shoulders tensed just for a moment, and Diana noticed. Every subtle reaction of his body was another piece of evidence, another confirmation of what she already knew. Margaret's laugh faltered. Richard, why are you even listening to this? She's just making things up. You don't actually think. Her voice trailed off when she saw her husband's jaw clench. Richard moved slowly toward the panoramic window, staring out into the sheets of rain, as though the storm could give him answers. His reflection in the glass looked smaller somehow, less certain. Without turning back, he asked in a voice that was supposed to sound calm but wavered slightly at the edges. And which hospitals did you mention in these reports of yours? Diana's eyes glinted. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Metropolitan, obviously, but also St. Augustine, Mercy General, Cedar Hills, all with the same patterns of overbilling and denial of treatment. The silence that followed was suffocating. Margaret frowned, not understanding, but Richard understood too well. Those 4 hospitals weren't random names. They were the very core of his medical investment empire. Diana watched him carefully, every flicker of expression on his face confirming her suspicions. His empire, built on lives reduced to numbers, was beginning to tremble under the weight of one soaked woman in his living room. Margaret finally broke the silence with a nervous laugh. Richard, you're not actually, are you? You're not worried about this, are you? But Richard didn't answer. He couldn't, because in his gut, for the first time in years, he felt it, fear, and Diana saw it, which meant her plan was working. The rain hammered harder against the glass, a steady roar that seemed to amplify the silence inside the Whitfield mansion. Richard Whitfield stood rigid by the panoramic window, his reflection fractured by streams of water sliding down the glass. His empire, his carefully built fortress of power, felt suddenly fragile. He hadn't expected this. Not here. Not tonight. Not in his own home. Behind him, Margaret tapped her manicured nails against the banister, trying to mask her unease with a laugh that sounded thinner and hollower than before. Richard, don't let her get to you. She's bluffing. Just another ex-nurse who thinks she knows how hospitals work. This is pathetic. But Richard didn't move. His mind was racing too quickly, every name Diana had spoken echoing like a drumbeat in his head. Metropolitan, St. Augustine, Mercy General, Cedar Hills. He knew those hospitals, he knew the contracts, he knew the numbers. And if she really had 3 years of reports? Diana broke the silence, her voice calm, almost gentle, though it carried an edge sharp enough to cut glass. Your empire is like glass, Mr. Whitfield. Beautiful, expensive, but fragile. One crack, and the whole thing shatters. Richard turned then, slowly, his eyes narrowing. You speak as though you've seen these contracts yourself. Diana tilted her head, water dripping from the ends of her hair onto the floor. I have. Margaret barked a laugh, high-pitched and shrill. Impossible, those documents are locked away, no one. She stopped when she saw the faintest shift in her husband's face. A shadow of doubt. Diana reached into her soaked coat, again this time producing a sealed plastic envelope. She laid it carefully on the coffee table next to Luna's photo. Inside were neat stacks of papers, signatures, seals, the kind of things most people would never recognize. But Richard knew them instantly. He'd seen his own pen scratch across those pages. You're wondering how I got them, Diana said quietly, watching his reaction. It wasn't difficult. Your secretary, Christina, was very helpful when I called last week to confirm our meeting today. Richard froze. His throat went dry, his voice little more than a whisper. Meeting? Diana smiled faintly. Of course. She thought I was Dr. Diana Santos, a medical audit consultant hired by your law firm to review hospital contracts. Christina emailed me everything I needed, 47 documents in total, some with your personal authorization stamp. Margaret's face paled. Richard, what is she talking about? Who is Christina? Richard's heart pounded in his chest. Christina had been his secretary for 2 years. Efficient, polite, quiet. He trusted her with everything. His mind reeled. Had she betrayed him? Or worse, had she been playing a role all along? Diana took a step closer, her voice still calm, almost soothing. You see, Mr. Whitfield, the people you think are loyal are only loyal until they realize the truth, until they see the blood on the balance sheets. Christina saw it. She gave me the keys to everything you thought was hidden. Richard's composure cracked. He reached for the envelope, but Diana placed her hand firmly on top of it, her gaze locking with his. Careful, she murmured. This isn't just paper. It's evidence. Margaret's voice broke into a scream. Evidence? Evidence of what? Diana turned her head slowly, meeting Margaret's frantic eyes. Of murder disguised as business. Of profits built on the backs of sick children. Of a system your husband designed, funded, and signed off on. The thunder outside boomed, like a verdict. Richard's face was drained of color, his eyes darting between the envelope and the woman who stood so calmly in his home, dripping rainwater but radiating power. And for the first time in decades, Richard Whitfield, the man who built an empire, on arrogance, felt trapped. Diana had just placed the first piece of the noose around his neck. The room seemed smaller now, though the Whitfield mansion stretched on for thousands of square feet. The ceiling felt lower, the air thicker, every breath charged with a tension that clung like the storm outside. Richard Whitfield, master of control, leaned forward over the coffee table, his eyes fixed on the envelope that held his world inside it. 47 documents, his signature, his stamp, his empire reduced to evidence sealed in plastic. Margaret hovered at the edge of the staircase, her face pale, lips pressed tightly together. She had never seen her husband like this, cornered. Her anger was giving way to something far more dangerous, fear. Diana Santos stood perfectly still, water still dripping from her coat, her calm presence cutting sharper than any blade. Her silence was deliberate, pressing on Richard like a weight until he finally broke it. His voice was low at first, almost measured. How much do you want? Margaret's head snapped toward him. Richard, what are you? But he didn't glance at her. His eyes were locked on Diana. You went through a lot of trouble to get here. You've made your point. You need money. Fine. Tell me the number. I can make this disappear. Diana tilted her head, studying him as though he were a specimen under glass. Her lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. It was the quiet recognition of a truth she had always known. Interesting, she murmured. Faced with the lives of children, your first instinct is to buy silence. Richard bristled. Don't twist this into something it's not. You need help, don't you? Your daughter, Luna was it? $5,000 a month? I can do that. I can cover her treatment. Tonight. I can set you up for life if that's what it takes. The storm outside cracked like a whip, lightning flashing through the tall windows, illuminating the hollowness in his offer. Margaret stepped forward, her voice rising in panic. Richard, stop. Don't you see? If you give her money, you admit she's right. Diana's voice sliced through Margaret's, shrill panic, calm and controlled. I don't need your money, Mr. Whitfield. What I needed was confirmation, and you just gave it to me. Richard froze. What are you talking about? Diana slipped a small notebook from her coat pocket and jotted something down, her movements slow, deliberate. Then she looked back up, her eyes steady. Bribery of a federal witness. Marcus will love to hear that. The color drained from Richard's face. Bribery? That's not... I was offering help. Compassion. Diana's laugh was soft, almost pitying. Compassion doesn't come with price tags and conditions. What you offered wasn't kindness. It was survival. For yourself. Margaret's voice trembled now, her arrogance cracking. Federal witness, Richard, what is she saying? What is happening? Richard ignored his wife, his focus locked on Diana. He leaned closer, lowering his voice as though intimacy might soften her. Listen, you don't know what you're dealing with. This world, it's complicated. Hospitals can't function without tough decisions. If you think you can tear this down, you're wrong. I have lawyers. I have influence. People depend on me. You don't want to go to war with me. Diana's eyes didn't waver. She leaned slightly forward, her voice steady, chilling in its quiet certainty. 3 years ago, I reported everything I found. Every falsified chart, every denied treatment, every child who died because of your greed. I gave you chances, Richard. I gave you time to change. But you didn't. Tonight isn't the beginning of a war. Tonight is the end of one. The thunder rolled again, shaking the glass panes. Margaret's hand clutched at the banister as though she needed it to keep standing. Richard's chest rose and fell quickly now, the control he prided himself on slipping away grain by grain. And Diana, standing soaked in their marble foyer, watched him unravel with the patience of someone who had waited years for this moment. Richard thought he could buy his way out. What he didn't know was that the trap had already snapped shut. The storm outside beat against the glass like a relentless drum, but inside the Whitfield mansion, the storm had already changed direction. It wasn't battering the windows anymore. It was battering Richard Whitfield himself. His composure, once as polished as the marble floors beneath their feet, had begun to crack. The brandy smoothness of his voice was slipping into something more frantic, less controlled. His wife, Margaret, hovered on the staircase with her arms wrapped around herself, her anger curdling into unease. And Diana Santos stood at the center of it all, still dripping rainwater, her face calm in a way that made the silence feel heavier than thunder. Without speaking, she reached into her bag again. Richard's eyes narrowed as he saw another plastic envelope appear, thicker this time, heavier, sealed with care. She set it down on the table, beside Luna's photograph and the contracts. Her movements were deliberate, precise, like a surgeon laying out instruments before an operation. Richard frowned. What's this? Diana didn't answer right away. She opened the envelope and slid the contents across the coffee table. Photographs, 17 of them, each one a different child. Their faces spilled across the polished wood like silent accusations. Some were smiling in hospital beds, clutching stuffed animals. Some had oxygen tubes taped across their cheeks. Some looked frail, their eyes too wise for their years. These, Diana said quietly, are the children your hospitals denied treatment to last year. 17 in total. Every one of them had treatment approved initially, then suddenly canceled after your executives reviewed the costs. Every one of them died within 3 months. The room went still. Even the storm outside seemed to hesitate. Margaret stepped forward, her eyes scanning the photos. She picked one up. a little girl with curly hair and bright eyes, smiling despite the hospital gown she wore. Margaret's hand trembled. She looks no older than 6. Her voice cracked. Richard, please tell me this isn't... Richard's jaw clenched, his face tightening into stone. Hospitals make difficult decisions. Not every case is viable. If we approved every expensive treatment, the institutions would collapse. No one would be saved. The thunder roared, shaking the chandeliers. Diana's eyes sharpened, but her voice remained steady. That's your justification? That hospitals must sacrifice children to stay profitable? You talk about financial viability while parents bury their babies. Margaret let the photo fall from her hands as if it had burned her. Her face was pale now, her eyes wide. Richard, 17 children? Tell me this isn't true. Tell me this woman is lying. But Richard couldn't look at her. He stared at the photos, and for the first time that night he couldn't hide the truth written across his face. Diana leaned forward, her voice a whisper that cut sharper than a scream. One of those children is named Emily Chun, 6 years old. Acute leukemia. Her treatment was approved and then revoked. Do you remember that name, Richard? His eyes flicked up, just for a second, but it was enough. The flicker of recognition, the flash of guilt, the tiny fracture in his mask. Diana saw it all. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. You knew? She whispered, horrified. You knew these cases? Richard finally snapped, his voice rising, brittle with anger. I am not responsible for every line item on a chart. Those were board decisions, hospital decisions, not mine. Diana's expression never changed. She tapped one of the photos with her finger, sliding it toward him. And yet your signature appears on the directives that denied these treatments. Over and over again. Signed, stamped, authorized. Margaret staggered back a step, as if the ground itself had shifted beneath her. Richard, she said again, softer this time, her voice breaking. How many? How many children? Diana's eyes didn't leave him. Her voice was quiet, deliberate. 17 documented last year. 143 in the last 5 years. All preventable. All sacrificed for profit. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, muffling the sob that escaped. The woman who had ridiculed Diana at the gate, who had sneered at her soaked clothes, now stood shaking in her silk robe, the weight of her husband's empire pressing down on her shoulders. For the first time. Richard, however, didn't move. His fists clenched at his sides, his face locked in a mask of stone. But his silence was louder than any confession. And Diana, watching him unravel piece by piece, knew she had just forced the first undeniable crack in his fortress. The photographs of 17 innocent faces lay scattered between them, silent proof that Richard Whitfield's empire wasn't just corrupt. It was murderous, and he could no longer pretend otherwise. The photographs lay scattered across the coffee table like shards of broken glass, each one reflecting a life that should have been. 17 faces stared back, smiles frozen in time, eyes filled with hope that had been stolen. The storm outside had become a steady roar, as if the heavens themselves were demanding an answer. Richard Whitfield stood rigid, his fists clenched, his jaw tight enough to crack. He wanted to shove the photographs off the table to scatter them out of sight, but he couldn't. His own signature glared back at him from the documents beneath them, undeniable proof that these children weren't lost to chance. They were casualties of decisions he had made. Margaret pressed herself against the staircase railing, her silk robe clutched at her chest, trembling. She looked like a woman watching her entire life unravel before her eyes. Richard, she whispered, her voice raw. Tell me she's lying. Tell me you didn't do this. His voice came out cold, mechanical, a desperate echo of the man who once commanded boardrooms with ease. Hospitals are businesses. You can't run them on emotion. Not every child can be saved. If we had approved every treatment, the system would have collapsed. Diana Santos stood as still as stone, her wet hair plastered to her cheeks, her clothes heavy with rain. but her voice carried like steel. "And so, you chose to collapse children instead. 17 in 1 year, 143 in 5. Do you know what those parents hear when you talk about the system? They hear the sound of a coffin lid." Margaret gasped, the words slicing through her like a blade. She shook her head violently, covering her ears. "Stop, please stop, Richard. How could you look at these faces and make that choice?" Richard turned toward her then, his eyes sharp, defensive. "You don't understand how this works. I didn't kill them. I made decisions to keep the doors open, to keep the lights on. If I hadn't..." Diana stepped forward, her hand slamming down on the stack of documents with a force that made Margaret flinch, her eyes locked on Richard's, unblinking. "If you hadn't, those children would still be alive." The words hung in the air like a verdict. The thunder outside seemed to echo them, rolling through the mansion's hollow halls. Margaret sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, her face pale, her body shaking. She picked up one of the photos again, her trembling fingers brushing over the little girl's smile. "She looks just like Emily," she whispered through her tears. "Richard, who are you?" Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. The mask he'd worn his whole life was cracking, and every second Diana stood in his living room, it cracked further. He turned back toward the window, his reflection warped by the rain, his breath fogging the glass. He looked less like a titan of industry now and more like a man cornered, a man finally realizing that the walls of his empire weren't walls at all, they were glass. And Diana was holding the hammer. She leaned closer, her voice calm but carrying the weight of every sleepless night she had endured, every page of every report she had written, every tear she had shed for the families he had destroyed. "Your empire isn't built on medicine, Mr. Whitfield, it's built on graves, and tonight you will answer for every single one." The doorbell rang then, loud, sharp, cutting through the storm and freezing everyone where they stood. Margaret's head snapped up. Richard stiffened. Diana's lips curved into the faintest smile, one that carried no joy, only certainty. She checked her watch, then looked back at Richard. "Right on time," she murmured. "Marcus is never late." Richard's heart thudded, in his chest, the name slamming into him with the force of a hammer. Marcus. He knew the name. And suddenly, for the first time in decades, Richard Whitfield felt the one thing his billions could never buy him protection from. Fear. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion like a gavel striking in court, loud, sharp, inescapable. For a moment everything froze. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, the rain beating softer against the glass as though the world itself leaned in to witness what came next. Margaret clutched the banister with trembling fingers, her silk robe clinging to her as tears streaked her face. Richard Whitfield, titan of hospitals and fortune, didn't move. He stood like a statue by the window, staring at his warped reflection in the glass, his chest rising and falling quickly. The ringing of the bell seemed to echo inside him, hollow and damning. Then footsteps, heavy, deliberate, approaching the front door. Diana Santos stood calmly in the foyer, droplets of water still dripping from her coat onto the marble floor. She looked at Richard with eyes that no longer belonged to a desperate mother, but to a woman who had waited years for this exact moment. "You should answer it," she said softly. "It's for you." Richard's throat worked, but no words came out. Margaret glanced between them, her panic rising. "Richard, who is it? Who's at the door?" Before he could reply, the lock clicked. The door swung open, and a rush of cold storm air flooded in. Framed by the glow of headlights from 3 black SUVs parked in the driveway, a tall man stepped into the mansion. His suit was dark, his coat soaked, but his presence filled the room with authority. Behind him, 2 federal agents followed, their badges gleaming as the light caught them. The man's voice was steady, calm, but carried the weight of steel. "Richard Whitfield?" Richard didn't answer. His hands, for the first time that night, shook. "Who are you?" The man reached into his coat, flipping open a leather wallet. Marcus Chun, federal prosecutor, and as of tonight, the man holding a warrant for your arrest. Margaret let out a strangled cry, stumbling back against the staircase. Richard's face went white. The name hit him like a bullet. Marcus Chun. He knew it. He remembered. And then Marcus said the words that split the room in two. Father of Emily Chun, 6 years old, acute leukemia, denied treatment by Metropolitan Hospital last October. Richard's breath caught. His knees nearly buckled. He remembered the board meeting, the chart, the calculation. Insurance value $300,000, treatment cost $200,000, deny. He remembered laughing with executives about the profit margin of death. And now her father stood in his living room. Marcus's voice dropped lower, every word deliberate. She died 15 days after you signed her death sentence. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard. Oh my God. You signed? Richard shook his head violently, his voice breaking. No, I didn't, I don't. But Diana's voice sliced through, calm and devastating. He did. I've heard the recordings, every directive, every denial, every death reduced to numbers, he knows them all. Marcus's jaw tightened, but his eyes never left Richard. We've been building this case for years. But tonight, he turned his gaze to Diana, then back to Richard. Tonight you handed us your confession. One of the agents stepped forward, snapping open a folder. Mr. Whitfield, we have a federal warrant for search and seizure of this property. You are under investigation for conspiracy to commit medical fraud, obstruction of justice, and the manslaughter of 143 minors. Margaret collapsed onto the stairs, sobbing. Her body shook violently, her cries filling the vast room. 143 children? Richard's voice broke into a frantic shout. This is a setup. You can't prove I knew individual cases. I was just an investor. Diana stepped forward, her hand sliding another document across the table. Investor? She said coldly. These contracts give you veto power over any treatment above $50,000. You didn't just invest, Richard, you decided. Marcus reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small audio recorder. He pressed play. Richard's own voice filled the room, cold and clinical. Emily Chun, 6 years old. Treatment approved, at $200,000. Insurance payout worth $300,000. Denied treatment. If she dies within 90 days, projected profit margin, $100,000. The storm thundered outside, but it was nothing compared to the silence that followed inside. Margaret let out a scream and covered her ears. Richard staggered back, his face drained of color, his body trembling, and Diana, watching him crumble, felt the weight of 3 years of patience settling at last. The predator had been unmasked. The father of one of his smallest victims now stood in his home, not just as a grieving parent, but as the man who would deliver his judgment. The storm outside was a furious symphony, thunder rolling over Beverly Hills like judgment itself. Inside the Whitfield mansion, the truth had already struck harder than lightning. Richard Whitfield stood pale and trembling, his own voice echoing through the room from Marcus's recorder, calculating the worth of a child's life in profit margins. His empire, once cloaked in power and prestige, lay stripped bare in front of his wife, his accuser, and the grieving father of one of his victims. Margaret sobbed on the staircase, her hands pressed to her face, shaking her head as if denial could erase the words she had just heard. Richard, tell me this isn't real. Tell me you couldn't. Her sobs trailed into silence because deep down she already knew the truth. Richard staggered toward the table, his hands trembling, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and desperation. You can't use that recording. It's illegal. You have nothing admissible. Nothing that ties me directly. Marcus stepped forward, calm and unyielding, his eyes burning with restrained fury. You confessed voluntarily in front of a federal witness. That's more than admissible. And your secretary, Christina, she's already turned over every contract you signed, every directive you gave, 2 years of inside evidence. You think this is just one recording? No, Richard, we've got them all. Richard froze. His lips parted but no sound came out. His world tilted under him, the control he had wielded over hundreds of lives unraveling in seconds. Then Diana's voice slid into the silence, low and steady, cutting through like a blade. Do you know what the most ironic part is, Richard? You had chances. Every report I filed, every red flag I raised, you could have changed the system, but you doubled down. You thought money would protect you. You thought arrogance would shield you. But it's arrogance that's destroying you right now. Richard's desperation boiled over. He lunged forward, snatching one of the photos from the table, the smiling face of a child, and he slammed it back down, his voice cracking. These are not my fault. Do you hear me? I didn't kill them. I didn't. Diana's eyes flashed. She stepped closer, her face inches from his, her voice like fire wrapped in ice. Then why are their names written next to your signature? Richard's breath hitched. His bravado collapsed, replaced by the hollow shell of a man who realized the walls around him weren't walls at all, they were bars. Margaret rose shakily to her feet, her tears streaming down her cheeks. How many, Richard? How many children's deaths are you responsible for? The silence stretched until Diana broke it. Her voice was soft, but it struck harder than a scream. 143, documented, all preventable. Margaret stumbled back, her knees nearly buckling. My God, she whispered, staring at her husband like she'd never seen him before. You're a monster. Richard spun toward her, his face twisted with panic. No, I did this for us, for this life, for everything we have. Margaret's scream tore through the room. At the cost of children's lives? At the cost of Emily? Her voice broke on the name, her hands shaking violently. You destroyed everything yourself. Agents moved closer, their badges flashing in the chandelier's light. Richard's chest rose and fell rapidly. He turned back toward Marcus, desperation burning in his eyes. Wait, please. We can settle this. I'll pay compensation. I'll donate, Marcus's face hardened, his voice sharp with finality. You can't buy your way out of burying my daughter. Or the other 142. This ends tonight. The thunder outside cracked like the sound of chains snapping shut. Richard's knees finally buckled and he collapsed into the leather armchair, his empire reduced to documents, photographs, and the weight of his own sins. And Diana, watching him crumble, felt the storm inside her finally begin to calm. 3 years of waiting. 3 years of silence. Tonight, justice had finally walked through the Whitfields' front door. The mansion that had once been Richard Whitfield's fortress of power now felt like a courtroom. The storm outside boomed and rattled the windows as though nature itself demanded a verdict. The photographs of children lay across the coffee table like evidence, the contracts beside them, his signature carved into every page like a scar. The agents flanked the room, silent but ready, and Richard sat slumped in the leather armchair, his breath ragged, his face pale, his empire crumbling around him. Margaret stood on the staircase, one hand clutching the railing for balance. Her silk robe clung to her, her eyes swollen with tears. She looked down at her husband as if she no longer recognized the man before her. You destroyed lives, Richard, she whispered. 143 children. And you did it without blinking. Her words sliced through the silence. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes burning with panic. I didn't kill anyone. Do you hear me? I didn't. Diana Santos stepped closer, her soaked shoes leaving faint prints on the marble. Her voice was calm, but the calmness only made it more devastating. 143 deaths are traced back to your decisions. Everyone preventable, everyone signed, sealed, and buried under your empire's profits. You may not have pulled the trigger, Richard, but you built the machine, and you turned it on. Richard's face twisted. He lunged forward, his voice cracking with desperation. You don't understand. Hospitals have to survive. If we approve every treatment, we all go bankrupt. I did what had to be done. Marcus Chun's voice thundered louder than the storm outside. You did what was profitable. Don't dress it up as survival. My daughter didn't die because of bankruptcy. She died because you chose a balance sheet over her life." The weight of the words filled the room. Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came. For once in his life, he had no argument left. An agent stepped forward, his hand resting on the cuffs at his belt. He looked to Marcus, who gave a small nod. "Richard Whitfield," the agent said clearly, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit medical fraud, obstruction of justice, and the manslaughter of 143 minors." The sound of metal clicking free was like a death knell. Richard jerked up from the chair, his voice rising in frantic shouts. "No, you can't do this. I have lawyers." Diana cut him off with a single sharp word. "Had." Richard froze, his mouth snapping shut. "Your lawyers," Diana continued, her eyes steady, "are being arrested right now in offices across the city. This isn't just you, Richard. It's your entire empire. The machine you built is collapsing and you can't stop it." The agent grabbed Richard's wrist, twisting his arms behind him. The sharp clink of the handcuffs echoed through the mansion. For the first time in decades, Richard Whitfield wasn't the man in control. He was the man being dragged away. Margaret stumbled down the stairs, her tears spilling freely. She grabbed one of the photographs off the table and shoved it into Richard's face. "Look at her," she cried. "Look at what you did. How many nights did I sleep in silk sheets while children like her died because of you?" Richard turned away, unable to meet the child's eyes. His shoulders sagged and the fight drained out of him. The agents began to pull him toward the door, his shouts echoing in the vast foyer. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I'll fight this. But his words rang hollow, drowned out by the storm outside and the quiet finality of Diana's voice. "You fought the wrong people, Richard. You thought the poor were powerless. You thought a nurse could be silenced. But it was arrogance that killed you long before we ever stepped inside this mansion." As the front door opened and Richard was dragged into the night, the cameras of waiting journalists flashed like lightning. The titan of medicine, the billionaire of Beverly Hills, the untouchable Richard Whitfield, reduced to an orange glow, under flashing lights, handcuffed, exposed, undone, and Diana Santos stood in the doorway watching him go, her chest rising and falling in steady breaths. 3 years of silence, of patience, of humiliation, all leading to this moment. The storm raged on, but inside Diana felt the first flicker of calm. Justice had finally arrived. The night Richard Whitfield was dragged away in handcuffs, the storm didn't stop at the mansion gates. It rolled straight into the headlines. By morning, the story was everywhere. Helicopters circled above Beverly Hills, their cameras zooming in on the sprawling Whitfield estate. Reporters stood in the rain-soaked driveway, their umbrellas trembling under the downpour as they shouted updates into microphones. Medical mogul Richard Whitfield arrested in midnight raid. Federal indictment, 143 preventable deaths. From boardrooms to handcuffs, billionaire empire collapses overnight. The photographs of children, the documents with Richard's signature, the recording of his voice coldly assigning value to Emily Chun's life. These pieces of evidence were leaked within hours. By noon, the nation was watching the fall of one of its most powerful men live on every screen. Inside the mansion, chaos reigned. Agents in dark suits swarmed through the grand halls, boxing up files, seizing computers, cataloging art that would be auctioned to repay victims' families. The Persian rugs Margaret had bragged about at countless dinner parties were rolled up and tagged as assets. The glittering chandeliers, the Italian sculptures, even the framed humanitarian awards Richard once posed beside, all were stripped from the walls like bones pulled from a carcass. Margaret sat on the bottom step of the staircase, her silk robe wrinkled, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. She watched strangers dismantle the life she thought was untouchable. Her phone buzzed relentlessly at her side, but the calls weren't from friends. They were from journalists. The women she had once lunched with in Beverly Hills cafes, the neighbors who envied her, the charities who once begged for her presence, all had vanished overnight. The empire of social prestige that had crowned her for decades dissolved in less than a day. She picked up one of the photos Diana had left behind, her fingers trembling. A little boy no older than 8, smiling weakly in a hospital bed. Margaret stared at it, her tears falling silently. "How many shoes? How many dresses?" she whispered. "Did I buy with money that should have saved you?" For the first time in her life, Margaret understood what her luxury had cost. Diana Santos, however, wasn't watching the chaos unfold from the mansion. She stood across the street beneath a black umbrella, Luna's photo tucked safely in her bag. She had no need to step foot back inside. Her work there was finished. The storm that humiliated her at those gates had become the storm that brought justice inside. Reporters spotted her, shouting questions, their microphones thrust into her space. "Miss Santos, is it true you're the whistleblower? How long were you undercover? Did you set him up?" Diana didn't answer. Her silence was deliberate. She wasn't here for fame. She wasn't here to gloat. She was here to watch an empire fall. Behind her, Marcus joined her beneath the umbrella. His face was solemn, but his eyes carried a quiet relief. "We got him," he said simply. Diana exhaled, her shoulders finally loosening. "We didn't just get him," she murmured. "We got all of them. Every name, every hospital, every executive who thought they could hide behind him." As the agents carried out box after box of evidence, the Whitfield mansion transformed before her eyes. It was no longer a palace of power. It was a crime scene. And in a matter of weeks, it would become something else entirely. A free community health center, funded by the auction of every last piece of Richard Whitfield's stolen wealth. Margaret would be gone by then, forced to move into a modest apartment under her maiden name, working quietly in a job that stripped her of every ounce of the arrogance she once wore like armor. And the world would forget her, just as it forgot every enabler of the powerful once they fell. But Diana would be remembered, not as a desperate woman selling cupcakes in the rain, but as the storm that tore down an empire built on children's graves. The rain slowed to a drizzle. Diana closed her umbrella and looked once more at the mansion that had tried to humiliate her, then turned away. Her work here was finished. Justice had stripped the Whitfields bare, and it was only the beginning. 6 months had passed since that stormy night in Beverly Hills, but for Diana Santos, the echoes of it still rippled through every corner of her life. The Whitfield mansion, once a symbol of untouchable wealth and cruelty, now bore a new sign at its gates: Whitfield Community Health Center. The marble floors where she had stood dripping rainwater were now walked by children, clutching teddy bears, mothers filling prescriptions they could finally afford, and doctors who worked without fear of being ordered to deny treatment. Every chandelier, every piece of artwork, every rug had been auctioned, their proceeds redirected to fund the center's operations. What had once been a palace of arrogance was now a beacon of healing. But Diana's journey didn't end at the mansion gates. She now walked the halls of Washington, D.C., not as a nurse dismissed for speaking out, but as the newly appointed director of federal medical fraud investigations. Her office overlooked the gardens where cherry blossoms bloomed, a far cry from the hospital basement where she once typed out reports no one would read. On the wall behind her desk hung framed photos, not of awards or accolades, but of children whose families had finally received justice. Faces that once lay buried beneath silence were now honored as the reason reform existed. Luna, her daughter, thrived. The treatment Richard once dismissed as too expensive had worked, and her leukemia was in remission. The little girl's hair had grown back in dark curls, and every morning she skipped into her private school with a backpack far too big for her small frame. Her laughter filled the home they now shared in Virginia, a laughter Diana once feared she would never hear again. At night, when Luna tucked herself in with her stuffed rabbit, the same one she clutched in the hospital photo Diana had shown the Whitfields, she would whisper her dreams of becoming a doctor. "So no kid ever has to beg like me." One afternoon, Marcus entered Diana's office carrying a folder thick with case files. His face, though hardened by years of grief, carried something new: peace. 143 families have received settlements, he said. 87 million in total. And it's only the beginning. The network was bigger than we thought. Whitfield was just the face of it. Diana closed her eyes, the weight of his words pressing into her chest. For years she had felt like her voice was a whisper drowned by thunder. Now it had become the storm itself. She turned to the photo on her desk, Luna at her second-grade graduation, wearing a paper crown she had made herself, holding a certificate with both hands, her smile so wide it nearly split her face. Diana touched the frame gently, her eyes wet with gratitude. "We did this for her," she said softly, "and for every child like her." Marcus nodded, his voice low. "And for Emily." The silence that followed was thick with meaning. Emily, Chun's face, 6 years old, would never walk into a classroom, never chase her dreams. But her father's pursuit of justice had ensured her death would not be in vain. Diana exhaled slowly, her voice firm now. Richard Whitfield thought he could bury the truth under money, under power, under marble and glass, but the truth outlives all of that. And now every child saved, every family compensated is another nail in the coffin of his empire. She leaned back in her chair, gazing out at the blooming gardens. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel calm. She had spent 3 years hiding, investigating, surviving humiliation, biding her time. Now she was no longer the desperate woman selling cupcakes in the rain. She was the woman who had taken down one of the most powerful men in America, with patience, precision, and unshakable courage. And as she gathered her files for the next investigation, Diana Santos knew one thing with absolute clarity. The fight was far from over. She had torn down one empire, but there were more. More hospitals, more corporations, more men who believed money made them untouchable. They were wrong, and the next time arrogance built itself a throne, Diana Santos would be waiting, calm as the rain, steady as the storm, unrelenting until justice was done. 6 months after Richard Whitfield's arrest, the storm that had once drowned Beverly Hills had become history. But the aftershocks of his empire's collapse were still unfolding across the nation. Trials filled courtrooms. Executives who once dined beside Richard now sat in the same orange jumpsuits, their names dragged through the mud of their own greed. Hospitals once polished in marble and gold were now audited line by line, their secrets pulled into daylight. But the most shocking piece of all had not yet been revealed. One quiet morning, the news broke. National networks interrupted their broadcasts, anchors speaking with solemn faces as new evidence surfaced from the federal investigation. It wasn't contracts, it wasn't financial records, it was recordings. Dozens of them. Secret boardroom meetings captured on audio and video, showing Richard Whitfield not just as an investor or a distant figure, but as the architect. The clips played across every screen in America. Richard's voice, cold and methodical, laid bare the truth. Patient ID 8472, pediatric oncology, treatment estimate $150,000, insurance payout on death $220,000, deny. Case 2219, heart surgery, age 11, cost outweighs projected returns, cancel authorization, write it off as administrative error. And then laughter, Richard's laughter. Executives chuckling with him, joking about how death had the highest profit margin. The nation recoiled. Parents clutched their children tighter as those words echoed through their living rooms. Politicians who once posed for photos with Richard scrambled to distance themselves. Foundations stripped his name from buildings overnight. Inside his prison cell, Richard watched it unfold on a flickering TV bolted to the wall. His cellmates, hardened men who had committed crimes of their own, turned to him with disgust in their eyes. Murderers, thieves, traffickers, men who had once been feared, looked at him with something colder than hate. He had killed children with paperwork. And in prison, there was no crime lower. Richard Whitfield, who once commanded boardrooms, with a signature, now folded laundry in an orange jumpsuit, his hands raw from bleach water, his eyes hollow. Every night the echoes of those recordings played back in his head, not because of guilt, but because he finally understood the truth. He wasn't untouchable. He was despised, forgotten, small. Meanwhile, in Virginia, Diana Santos sat in the backyard of her modest home, watching Luna chase butterflies in the garden. The girl's curls bounced as she ran, her laughter carrying on the summer breeze. She stopped suddenly, holding her stuffed rabbit in one hand, and turned back to her mother. "Mama," she said with a smile that could light the darkest night, "when I grow up, I'm going to be a doctor. I'll help kids like me. For free." Diana's throat tightened. She walked over, kneeling in the grass, pulling her daughter into her arms. "And you'll be the best doctor the world has ever seen," she whispered. Inside, the TV hummed with another news update. The Whitfield mansion has officially reopened today as a community health center, offering free treatment for children. It was suggested by the very woman who exposed the fraud, Diana Santos. Marcus, standing by the patio with a file in his hands, smiled faintly as he watched Luna twirl in the sunlight. "You know," he said softly, "Time magazine wants to put you on the cover again. Person of the Year." Diana shook her head with a quiet laugh. "It's not about me, Marcus. It's about them. The 143 families who finally got justice. And the thousands more who never will, but whose future is safer now." Her eyes lifted to the horizon. The storm that once drenched her at the Whitfields' gate had carried her here, to safety, to healing, to power she had never sought but could never turn away from. Richard Whitfield had thought the best revenge was money, influence, arrogance. He was wrong. The best revenge was watching everything he built transform into something he could never control, a legacy of healing instead of harm. And as Luna laughed in the garden, Diana realized the truth she had been waiting to say aloud. "The sweetest revenge," she whispered, "isn't destroying your enemies. It's rising so far above them that they spend the rest of their lives looking up from the hole they dug themselves into." The storm was over. Justice had spoken. And for the first time in years, Diana Santos allowed herself to breathe freely.